All right, so for this next section, we're going to talk about resumes. Specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about how to format, how to design your bullet point, tailoring your resume for the job, because yes, you should do that, and then references. So in building your resume, there's going to be different sections that you're going to want to design. You're going to want to begin with your heading. So in considering your heading, I personally like to put that in the actual header space of the document. So double click either if you're on Google Docs or Word and put your heading in that section. That generally will give you a couple extra lines of space on your resume. And your heading should include your name, your contact information, and potentially any links to your LinkedIn or portfolio that you might want people to see. Your name should be the biggest thing on your document. So your name should be big, bold, preferably maybe a couple points larger than any of the other text on the document. When providing your contact info, you definitely want to provide your phone number and email. But for address, I prefer that you really just put your city and state. It's not necessary to put your full address in your heading unless the employer explicitly asks for that. And that's partly because adding your full address is kind of archaic. It's something that people used to do when they were physically mailing out their resumes to employers, so they had a return address. It's not something that is necessary presently when submitting applications online. Your LinkedIn, I would not recommend posting the link of your LinkedIn in your resume until you feel like your LinkedIn is complete and fleshed out. Portfolios can include art portfolios, sample text potentially if you need to submit, if you want to demonstrate your writing skills. And then moving on, you definitely want your education section as one of the top sections on your document. That obviously isn't going to be something that is going to be a recommendation forever. The further out you get from your education, the less likely you'll need it to be at the top, as it may become less relevant over time compared to other experiences you've had. But presently, I would recommend putting your education section at the top. That's partly because you just spent the last 4 years completing your degree. And that's going to be the biggest demonstration of your experience is the degree you earned, your major, the college you went to, demonstrating that you graduated, and then also including your thesis. CLBR is regularly having conversations with students about including your thesis. The topic may not be something that's going to be particularly interesting to employers, but what your thesis demonstrates is your ability to complete a long-term project, your ability to implement certain skills like time management, critical analysis, written skills, working collaboratively with faculty members, research. And so that's why it's super valuable to have your thesis on your document, is not necessarily the topic, but a lot of the employable skills that are demonstrated in completing the thesis at all. And then also any academic awards, honors, grants that you earned at your time at Reed or any other colleges. Then next, you're going to want to develop your experience section. Experience can include internships, jobs, volunteer experiences that you've had. Of course, that's going to vary depending on the industry you're going into. But what you want to make sure is that you have a standard format for any of the positions and experiences you've listed. So the position title, company name, city and state. And then you always want to provide your date of employment and involvement, and preferably that's going to be month, year. Even if it was a summer experience, I would still recommend providing the month and the year, because summer is going to be a little bit subjective depending on where this document is going. And so just to be concrete, always provide the month and the year of employment. And then you're going to want to provide 2 to 5 bullet points describing your duties, tasks, and skills required. The most relevant experiences should have the most bullet points. And then finally, additional sections can include relevant coursework, skills, activities, involvement, and potentially volunteer work. I know I mentioned including volunteer work in your experience section. Really, it's going to be up to you to gauge how deeply involved you were with this volunteer work. If this was something that you did consistently for a long time, you had a lot of duties and tasks that were assigned as a volunteer, then you may want to consider including it in your experience section. However, if it was more of a one-off experience that you did and you didn't necessarily have a lot of responsibility that was attached to it as a volunteer, you may want to consider providing it in an additional section like additional experiences or extracurricular experiences, some other section that is assigned a little less prestige than your work experience section. Relevant coursework is pretty common. I see that a lot for econ students who are trying to get jobs like potentially in finance or investing, banking, where you maybe haven't had an internship or job experience yet, but you've done a lot of work in class that's very applicable. And so you want to demonstrate that though you haven't had the work experience yet, you've applied the knowledge and skill in other spaces such as coursework. Really, most employers aren't concerned with where you got the experience, just that you can demonstrate that you have it. So depending on what you're applying to, the relevant coursework section is going to be something you may want to consider implementing if you have coursework that is very relevant to the job you're applying to. Your skills. What we are going to recommend at the CLBR is that you only list your hard skills versus soft skills. Hard skills are going to be foreign languages, programs, statistical software. Anything that's really measurable is going to be considered a hard skill. Whereas soft skills are going to be things like friendly, team player, customer service. Those things aren't going to be as measurable because they're pretty subjective to who is reading the document and what they consider to be friendly, right? So skill section should really only be hard skills, not soft skills. 4 things to really consider. Keep your resume to 1 page in length unless the job description states otherwise. If there isn't anything on the job description that says the resume can be 1 to 2 pages or include your CV. If it doesn't have anything explicitly stating that, just assume to keep it to 1 page. I wouldn't necessarily say that's an industry standard, but it's pretty consistent if you consider the quantity of applications coming in for a certain job. Being able to succinctly demonstrate your experiences on a document is what employers are going to prefer. And generally, as graduating seniors, you should be able to keep it to a page. And if you're having trouble with that, please let us know and we can help. Ensure that you have consistent formatting throughout the document. White space is absolutely your friend. Consistent formatting is going to be kind of what I mentioned earlier. When you're listing your experience section, use the same structure when you're talking about, if you have a relevant coursework section, a volunteer section, work experience section, use the same method throughout, same size bullet points, same type of font, and same spacing. And then when we say white space is your friend, that means really trying to look at your document from an aesthetics point of view. So what I often recommend people do is use both your left and your right margin. So tabbing over and pushing all of your to and from dates to the right of the margin to really kind of pull out some of that content that's spaced along the left margin and really try and space it out so there's some symmetry down the middle of the document. And if you're not sure how to kind of spatially do that, again, let us know. We're happy to help. CLBR advisors love making resumes beautiful. So please ask us if you're not sure. And then 3, cut information from high school. I would say at this point, you should have enough content from your college experience that you shouldn't need high school experiences on the document anymore. And in your education section, do not include high school. It's assumed that you completed high school. So at this point, go ahead and be critical in cutting that information out of your document. Finally, experience and involvement should be listed in reverse chronological order. So that means having your most recent experience at the top and your oldest experience at the bottom. I know on campus, a lot of students hold multiple jobs at one time, and that can be kind of challenging in considering how to include them in reverse chronological order. For example, if you started 2 jobs in the same month, you started 2 jobs fall semester in the same month, go ahead and put the job that is the most relevant on top of the other. Um, do not put jobs in order of relevance. So if you had a job 3 years ago that's really, really relevant to the description, the job description, don't put that at the top. There are actually ways to kind of maneuver your experiences such that you can put it toward the top of the document. For example, if you had a job 3 years ago that's especially relevant, you could break out those sections so that way the top section could be quote unquote relevant work experience. And then your bottom section below that could be considered additional work experience. So that way you're able to still use reverse chronological order, but putting the relevant work experience at the top and then anything additional in the bottom section. That way you're really pushing the most relevant things toward the top of the document without breaking the reverse chronological order rule. Building the perfect bullet point. So I think this is sometimes the most challenging part of the resume, is really having to think back about what you did in your job and explain that succinctly on a document to somebody else who does not know you, right? So a lot of times what I see are bullet points often have the first half of what the employer needs to know about your experience. So oftentimes people will list the power verb, the skill, and then what you did, the job responsibility. And so, for example, in my job, a more poor example of a bullet point would be advise students on career needs. And that's pretty blanket. It doesn't give a lot of context to why I did that, how I did that, what the outcome was. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about, is how to make a full bullet point. And so you're going to see here, we've kind of turned this into somewhat of an equation of skill plus what you did plus the purpose, method, result. Keep in mind, sometimes when you're talking about your bullet points, purpose, method, result is going to be kind of hard to include all 3 of those in the bullet point. So if you feel like it's too much to include when trying to describe a part of your job, maybe only choose 1 or 2 of those 3. But the purpose is going to be why you did that, method is how you did that, and then result is what happened because of it, what was the outcome. And additionally, I would add that when you're constructing your bullet points, try and quantify whenever possible. So an example here would be in quantifying, programmed 3 career-related events per semester for senior economic students in order to better connect them with alumni in their chosen field. So there you can see that I used a power verb, programmed. What I did, I programmed events for senior economic students. Why did I do that? In order to connect them with alumni in their chosen field. And then I also quantified how many I did per semester. And you see there, I didn't include the method or result. I only included the purpose, because if I tried to include the method or result, that bullet point would end up being like 2 or 3 lines long, right? So again, sometimes you can't include all 3 in a bullet point, but at least try to include 1. Here's an example of where you can see a poor bullet point that's missing a piece, right? So for one of the examples is going to be performed gear mapping for transmission. We can see there that includes the skill and what you did, but it's missing the purpose. So a better way to frame that would be performed gear mapping for transmission to optimize shift patterns, fuel economy, and available power. Another example is going to be collected quantitative infrared imaging. Again, that doesn't tell me how you did that, and that doesn't necessarily demonstrate any skill that you might have in being able to do that task. So a better bullet point would be collected quantitative infrared imaging using a high-speed infrared camera. What that tells me is that you know how to use a high-speed infrared camera. Going on, and actually before we go on, I would add um, one thing to keep in mind that I notice a lot of students do is trying to keep the bullet point only to one line. It's okay if your bullet point goes over a line. If it's 2 lines long max, that's okay. Um, I would say 3 lines is too many, but 1 to 2 lines is perfectly fine for your bullet points. Next, we're going to talk about tailoring your resume for a specific job. Um, you should absolutely do this if at all possible. Sometimes, of course, tailoring your resume for a specific job might be a little bit more challenging because your experiences are set in the present, they've already happened. And so, really, what we mean here is that you want to consider what bullet points are going to be the most connected to the job. When you think back on your experience, you may have 15 to 20 different tasks that you had when you worked at a specific job. And so really it's thinking through, of those 15 to 20 tasks that I had, which ones should I showcase? Which ones are going to be the most relevant and connected to the job description that I'm applying to right now? Um, Oftentimes what I recommend students do is create a rough master resume that just has everything, every bullet point for every job that you've ever done listed. And then when you apply to positions, you can just go and pluck which of those bullet points from a job are going to be the most relevant. So that way you're not having to recreate the wheel and remember everything you did. You just have a really detailed list of bullet points of all the things you did in every job set somewhere that you can pluck and copy and paste into your resume. Um, but one, getting to know the job description. So read through the job description and highlight important tasks and skills. I feel like this is just like studying, really taking the time to consider the job description, thinking through keywords that they're using, thinking through the skills, both hard and soft skills that they're really asking for in an applicant and where you connect most with those, the tasks that they're describing, and if you've done anything similar that or more aligned that you can really speak to in your resume. Oftentimes, it's important to remember that job descriptions are a wish list. Um, it is very much not expected that you are going to be able to do every single thing in that job description right off the bat. So really what you want to think about is what's listed here, what are things that I 100% can already do and know I can do versus what are things that I may not have experience with but are somewhat transitional, things that I've maybe had similar experiences with that I can speak to in my resume. Employers are going to be really considering, like, is this person trainable? Has this person had similar experiences? For example, you've coded with R, but you haven't coded with Stata. Or you've coded with Python, but you haven't coded with something else. And so it's really demonstrating, oh, the job description asks for R, I have Stata experience. How can I demonstrate that though I don't have R, I have the transferable skill to learn? And so it's okay if you find a job description where you don't fit every single checkbox. It's really just making the case for how you're prepared to learn and how you have transitional skills from your prior experience. Next, include keywords in your resume. So I mentioned that earlier, really looking for the phrases and terms that they're using and how you can somewhat incorporate those into the resume and potentially into your cover letter too. So if they continuously mention that they're a small team that works really closely and collaboratively, um, start thinking about times in which you've had to do that. Really speak to that in your resume about the collaborative work that you've done in small groups, right? Obviously, we're not telling you to completely mimic what they're saying in the job description, but really start trying to read almost between the lines to think through, what are they trying to tell me here? That they obviously are a small team, which means they probably are in communication with each other regularly. Working collaboratively means that they probably have to work to set timelines for each other and check in on each other, take feedback from each other. And so those are things that you're going to want to consider when you're reading that job description, or those keywords that hint at you, okay, these are things that I need to include in the resume to demonstrate that I would be a good member for this team. Next, highlight your relevant experience. So make sure your bullet points exemplify the skills listed in the job description. So again, like I mentioned earlier, your most relevant experience should have the most bullet points. And so really making sure, because readers are reading the document from top to bottom, that your most relevant experience is toward the top of the document, that your most relevant bullet points are toward the top of that section of your work experience. And that they really speak to the job description. So it's not like you have to have 3 bullet points per job description, right? You don't want to have to force it. So really thinking through, what have I done that's the most relevant, that I really should expand on, give the most context toward. That way they can really see the most relevant things and not miscellaneous bullet points in order to just fill out that section. 4, don't forget to proofread. This is really important, partly because the hiring process is biased. And so there are a lot of little things that you could do that you don't realize you're doing that are going to turn the employer off. And so making sure to really proofread your document, or have somebody else read through your document to catch those little things that you potentially didn't see because you had been looking at the resume for so long, right? And if you need, we're happy to review and proofread your resume before you turn it in. But that's a really, really easy step that you can take to make you more competitive than everyone else in the applicant pool who didn't take the time to proofread their document. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about references. So references should not be listed on your resume unless someone explicitly asks for it in the job description. So if the job description says include references on resume, or include references on a separate document, go ahead and list them. But otherwise, I wouldn't provide that information unless they ask for it. Generally in the hiring process, references won't be asked for until you're a final candidate. So the best thing you can do is give your references a heads up, but it's not something that you necessarily are expected to include until you are requested. Or potentially, I think another scenario would be if you're applying for a job in which there is an application portal where you are inputting information such as your address, you have to attach your cover letter, your document, and then they might have like a section for you to input your reference information. If you're working within one of those application portals, then that would be a case in which I would encourage you to include your references. But if you're simply emailing in your resume and cover letter to an employer, it's not something you should include unless you're asked to. 3, references should be submitted on a document with the same letterhead as your resume and cover letter. So again, your documents, your resume, cover letter, references, they should all look related to each other. So it should be the same, format, same header, same font size, same font. They should all look synonymous to each other. This is partly, I mean, aside from the fact that it aesthetically is more pleasing, this is also because if they were to print off your materials and then 50 other people's materials, um, and then all of the papers were accidentally dropped and 150 separate sheets of paper were all dropped on the floor, they should be able to pick up all those pages and eventually come to find that all 3 of your documents belong to you, because they all look related. That's like a worst case scenario, of course. And then 4, be sure to give your references a heads up that they will be contacted. This can be sometimes tricky. So best case scenario, your references are super excited that you're applying for the job. They're telling you to go for it. And so you can be very transparent with them that, hey, I'm applying for a job. You know, I'd be really grateful if you'd be my reference. I'm planning to submit the application materials tomorrow. And I will be in contact with you throughout the process to let you know when they might call you. That's obviously best case scenario. A more challenging one would be that you aren't sure how your employer is going to feel about you transitioning to a new job. So you have to be really considerate about when to inform them about when they might be contacted or called. And so in that case, giving them a heads up might be if you're being considered as a final candidate, you know, the new employer calls you and wants to let you know that they'd like to give you a final round interview, and then upon that final round interview, we'll be contacting your references. That would be a good point in which you might want to let your employer know, hey, you know, I have been applying for jobs and have actually been going through the application process for this current position that I'm really excited about. I have been contacted about getting a final round interview, and they've informed me that if I'm successful at this final round interview, they will likely be contacting my references. You know, again, I would be really grateful if you would offer me a reference. Obviously, that conversation can go a variety of ways, but really, it's going to come down to timing, depending on how comfortable you are with your employer, knowing that you're applying for other positions. And that negotiation can sometimes be tricky. So if you're unsure about when to tell your employer how to have that conversation, please let the CLBR know and we'll be happy to help. All right, activity time. So we're going to work a little bit on tailoring your resume to the job description, the job you selected earlier in the presentation. So go ahead, take some time to find your resume wherever it may live in your computer. If you don't yet have a resume, go ahead and start taking some time to jot down your experiences, including work experience, volunteer, internship, relevant coursework you've taken, any grants or awards that you received, skills you have. Really start taking the time to just think back on all the things you've done and really jotting that down somewhere. And then the second step would be to start thinking through how you're going to format that information. But step 1 is just gathering the information. And then if you're, of course, not sure, please reach out to CLBR.